Hi everyone, here we are back to chapter 7, the final chapter in this section before we move on to the next one. So we're going to talk about attitude and attitude change. So our learning objectives are defining attitudes and describe attitude components, describe the functions of attitudes, understand how the hierarchy of effects concept applies to attitude theory, comprehend the major consumer attitude models, describe attitude change theories and their role in persuasion, and understanding how message and source affects the influence persuasion. So again, this is another chapter we're going to go in, into tremendous depth on everything, but just a general understanding of attitudes and their relationship to consumer behavior. So attitudes are a relatively enduring overall evaluations of objects, products, services, issues, people. It's a measure of favor or disfavor that people have about things, and oftentimes it's very closely related to value. How much the greater the positive attitude, the greater people believe that the greater value the product delivers. So there's the ABC approach to attitudes: affect, behavior, and cognitions or thoughts. So there's a functional theory of attitudes. Attitudes perform the following functions: utilitarian function, knowledge function, value expressive, and ego defensive. What does that mean? Oh my God. So essentially, our attitudes will influence how we feel, the function of the product, and the function of our attitudes or feelings of favor or disfavor about the product. So we'll talk a little bit about each one of them. Utilitarian attitudes are used as a method to obtain rewards and to minimize punishment. So high school boys wear a cool brand so they fit in. That's utilitarian. Knowledge function of attitudes allows consumers to simplify their decision-making process. So if someone is very loyal to Apple, they believe that they're the best, so they won't look anymore. Value expressive function of attitudes enables consumers to express their core values, self-concept, and beliefs to others. So a consumer supports Greenpeace because he places much value on environmentalism. And then finally, ego defensive. Ego defensive function of attitudes works as a defense mechanism for consumers to avoid facts or to defend themselves from their own self-concept. So that's this idea that when we talked earlier about, putting brand personality, so to speak. So smokers discount information that suggests that smoking is bad for their health would be ego defensive, trying to maintain their self-esteem. So there's this whole idea of hierarchy of effects. So attitude approach that suggests that affect, behavior, and cognitions, ABC, that's the ABC model, form a sequential order. So there's high involvement, low involvement, experiential, and behavior. So that what will happen first. So if you have a high involvement, it's thinking first. Low involvement is also thinking first. Experiential, behavioral. Let's see that. Why is that happening like that? Here we go. High involvement hierarchy occurs when a consumer faces a high involvement decision or addresses a significant problem. Low involvement, consumers have basic beliefs about products without having strong feelings towards them. Experiential explains impulse purchases. And behavioral is this idea that without either beliefs or affect being strongly formed beforehand, some behaviors occur, just sort of spur of the moment almost. So multi-attribute attitude model combines a number of pieces of information about a belief and evaluation of attributes of an object. So you're looking at things with not just one-dimensionally. So the HEO, or attitude towards the object model, is known as the Fishbein model. Fishbein model, you'll often see that. We talk about that sometimes with a way to make a decision. So there are key elements that there are specific beliefs that someone has about a product attributes, and the strength of those attitudes will determine how people evaluate the product. So the formula, not important, but there it is. So here we go. Attitude towards the object. So the attitude towards the object, the strength of the belief, the evaluation, and the number of attributes and beliefs. So essentially, what's important to know is there's this whole idea of the compensatory model, that low ratings for one attribute are compensated by higher ratings for another. So if something's too high, the price is too high, but the quality is good, you might, change your mind about that. It might influence it, or, or the amount of need you have for it, or somehow you can rationalize it. So other models about attitude towards the object, ATO model. Some other have developed our attitudes don't always predict behavior, but we do like to have this idea of some level of consistency, that there's a strong relationship between the attitudes and the actual behavior. Okay, then there's the behavioral intentions model. Hang on. Again, you don't necessarily need to know that. But the point of all of these things is that you have to understand there's relationships between people's attitudes and people's behaviors, or how people think about something, and how we sort of rationalize these things in our mind. And there are many different influences that we have on us. Some are subjective, some are objective, and then marketers like to measure how that's going to impact the buying process. So again, the theory of the planned action expands upon the behavioral intentions model. It includes a perceived control component. So it's another thing that will play into this whole idea of perception. So here we go. Behavioral intentions. It's also known as a theory of reasoned action. So understanding, that a certain behavior will lead to some sort of consequence, and evaluating the consequence, whether or not it's worth it. If you can, the cost of it, how much, the cost of it, how much you have to give up, might influence something, and something that we believe we have to conform to some societal norm, and then also that's tied in with our motivation to be part of a reference group. So mostly when we look at these things, most research has been expanded to understand attitude towards advertising and companies, so how people feel about certain ads. And a marketer or researcher can have some sort of attitude tracking to track changes in consumer attitudes. So for example, like Aldi's, people might have had a negative attitude towards Aldi's in the beginning when it was first introduced in the United States, because they saw it as a discount grocery store, but now they see it as, they can track how maybe people's attitudes towards that store has changed through different behaviors. So there are a variety of different approaches. We'll talk about them. ATO, behavioral influence, schema-based, elaboration likelihood, balance theory, and social judgment theory. So let's take a look. So ATO, marketers can attempt to change consumer attitudes by changing beliefs or creating new beliefs about a product, changing evaluations of product attributes, so the kind of thing. Behavioral influence approach proposes that behavior precedes thought and affect, and schema-based affect approach says that basically an attitude towards a brand can change if the schema or the story or the narrative around the product changes. So you change the attitude about, that people have about different types of grocery stores. It might influence whether or not they purchase from there. And again, this is not necessarily super important to know about, but the idea is that through communication, marketers can change people's perception. So there are central cues and there are peripheral cues. Central cues are information that's presented in a message about the product itself, and peripheral cues are things that are non-product related, that might, again, might speak to brand personality or, the quality of the company, that kind of thing. So then there's also this whole idea of balance theory, that people want to maintain some level of equilibrium, and generally speaking, people prefer some level of consistency among their beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. That, again, this whole idea of homeostasis, keeping things status quo or even. And it's important for marketers to understand how target markets might perceive, like, for example, how someone might perceive an endorser, someone who's endorsing a product, an opinion leader. So there you go. There's an example. Someone as an observer, they might have, Peyton Manning endorsing Papa John's might have an influence on them. It balances it out. They might not have had a good influence. They might not have a good attitude towards Papa John's, but if Peyton Manning says it's okay, then it must be okay. All right, then there's also this idea of social judgment theory, that consumers compare information to existing attitudes about an object or an issue. So again, this whole idea of consistency, that attitude change depends upon how consistent the information is with the initial attitude or their initial feeling about something. And again, it's important to understand your target market and understand what it is that they're willing to accept, what their range of acceptance is, their latitude of acceptance is, and provide a product and a message equal that falls in within that latitude. So there you go. Negative versus positive, but you want to make sure that you're someplace in the middle there. So message effects and persuasion. This idea that you want to make sure that the message that you're sending is somehow persuasive and something that will appeal to the target market, and something that somehow will appeal to the target market and will get them in, get whatever the personality traits or attitudes they might have. And where the ad is placed, the exact message it's used, what the ad looks like, what kind of, what characters or images are used in it, in the ad, and that kind of thing. So we talked about communication earlier in this, the sender and the receiver, and these are also some things that are important. People will, how they feel about the source. That's why you'll see sometimes if a celebrity, gets involved in some sort of scandal or some sort of behavior that is not becoming of the brand or the product, it'll get dropped. So how credible are they? Attractive, likability, meaningfulness, all these kinds of things. So can you relate? Can you trust the person? And do you still relate to that person who's giving you the information about the product? So here we go. Just a summary here. Components of the attitudes: affect, behavior, and cognition. Functions of consumer attitudes are utilitarian, knowledge, value expressive, and ego defensive. We went through those. The hierarchy of effects: high involvement, low involvement, experiential and behavioral influence. Consumer attitude models, HEO and behavioral intentions models, and the message and its source can affect persuasion. Okay, so that's it. That's wrapping up chapter 7, and thanks for listening.